I wish to move sideways in terms of this evolution of ideas of the design of new communities to talk about three alternative utopias. And firstly, let me talk about the precedent, which was clearly this. And you're looking at the Haussmann scheme for Paris, worked out by Haussmann and Napoleon III. And this is an important story in the ideas behind modernity. So in this, Napoleon III was looking very strongly for power, for prestige. He probably in some ways wished that he was Napoleon I. And he had the idea of the complete transformation of Paris. And what you're seeing in these lines, and you can see the circles which are arrondissements, is the principle that in the core of Paris there would be an architectural revolution. And basically the old buildings would be pulled down, the poor would be moved out, they would be moved out of these prized parts, the streets would be made decent in the form that is called boulevard. And so here you're looking at the Avenue l'Opéra, and you can see underneath this the old scale of Paris, somewhat organic, you might use the word haphazard form, and this ruling of the surveyor, the theodolite, the measuring stick, that would transpose and transfix Paris in this alarming manner. So here you have, this was firstly thought up in 1850 rather, and so here you've got a sort of more detailed scheme of 1876. So here landlords and banking could begin to take over, and on these grand avenues would become the new homes of the city. What is important is not only the fact of a complete lack of respect for the existing, but also the principle that you could separate society through urban form, and you could create an entirely new architecture. So now looking at this black and white photograph, just to give the feeling and the sentiment of what this is about, you've got the green boulevard moving through it, and you've got this very bold architecture which has produced the style of the way that possibly we more read Paris than almost anything else. So here is a dilemma. The dilemma is that you could say, from the one hand, you could look at this and say it created the beautiful city, or what we've referred to as city beautiful, this idea of a city where the neighborhoods come into these incredible street systems, but you can also see that it is a destruction. It is an idea that to be seen to be on the move in Paris, to be seen to be part of this new framework of the city, was the future. And this brought about three books that I want to reference that take us possibly off track. You may not agree with me, but certainly I need to mention them because they were produced by really famous architects and have certain alliance in the first two and a complete separation in the third. Here is the first one that you may have heard less of. Tony Garnier's very well-known French architect who had produced many fine buildings, produced his work Cite, Industrielle. A book that is quite remarkable. You can see it in the library today. And in 1904, he produced a book that is entirely graphic. And the principle behind the city is one of the functional city. Form follows function, came as a later phrase, but here you've got the functional city, and it falls into a separation of functions where work, homes and entertainment and recreation form clear and separated zones in a city planned to be a clean city for 35,000 people. Note the 35,000, which is the same size of Howard used in the Garden City. So there may be some story that behind this of how this is fighting against the sort of nostalgia of that form of city, because everything here is at right angles. So in the, probably easier with the diagram. So here in the diagram of it, all the power is coming from the hydroelectric station, all the industry and access from the river. From the river you can see you come into docks. The docks are part of a pattern that is an industrial unit, we probably call it industrial estate, prefabricated buildings, all straight avenues, served by rail, because of course at that time, 1904, rail was the key. The same but a different rail moves right through the core of the residential area that you're seeing to the northwest through this part of the city. The rail dips underneath the civic centre, which becomes a special place. You might well be thinking of ideas such as Chandigarh, as you see this diagram of a civic centre of this type, and you can see the very strongly orthogonal nature of this area, and lo and behold, the old town is left as something antiqued and separated and not part of this. And the other principle, there are probably two more that are absolutely key. One that was referred to as cordon sanitaire, the idea that by sitting these grid structures in nature, one would be healthy, and anything unhealthy, you see where the hospital has been placed, that is the part that's moved out. So this is a place that isn't going to have disease. And so here you can begin to see a unit that is spelling modernity, but the key modernity also comes through prefabrication. Everything in this 1904 new town comes out of a factory. So here you see quartier d'habitation, so you're looking at a variety of units of different size, different expense, all laid out in this way, but all emerging out of a factory system. So here it is, and you can see the cleverness of Garnier's graphic. These essentially concrete blocks, they're probably not all that different in some ways from military defense units, but they're coming out and they can be made particularly nice because of all these great trees coming up through them and all the flowers everywhere. So this idea of a modern France, a progression, a change in the way that we live becomes incredibly important. And you can see a beginning of a field of uniformity interlinked with everything that isn't uniform is nature, but we are producing this very uniform environment, and even more so when we come to the port. There's something you could say is strikingly modern about this, isn't there? So here we are more than 100 years later, and we could look at this and say the covering a part of the port structure is not all that different from perhaps looking at an airport. We've got these factory units, these incubators coming off for production and storage, and how wondrous this is, and even more so when we consider the role of hydroelectric power and what a modern future would be. But in looking at this, it began to bring about a couple of very different diagrams. These, and I make no apology for my slides, are taken from an exhibit that I went to in Paris, and we're looking at two ideas that emerged to begin with almost simultaneously. One was going back to Haussmann. So Le Corbusier, that we're looking at a Corbusian drawing now, and it becomes self-evident in, if you haven't worked it out already, believed that Haussmann was the first great Frenchman of the modern era, and that anticipated that the reform of the city was the first key. So here we have Notre Dame before most of it burnt down, and you look at the top cartoons and you can see something in scale with Notre Dame, and then we're left in the bottom with what we should do in the future. We're leaving this isolated monument, this icon of a past age, but everything else would be the new city. This, in my view, this 1922 scheme is one of the most dangerous sets of drawings and ideas that I know of. Put in summary, much of the core of Paris is pulled down. You can just about tell here is Notre Dame in this. Perhaps kindly they've left the Ile de Cite, and you come over in the Marais and you look and it's gone completely, and it's gone with this unit. This became all important, this a cruciform tower block that would stamp through and will be in a floating set of gardens with elevated freeways that would transform the way that we move through the city. So again, looking back at Haussmann, how important this idea to be on the move, to be fast-paced, and how you would want to live in one of these new architectural edifices in the city. Now, this is a long way from where we've been so far, and I think it's incredibly important to mention it, because when we look at the Siam group working after and during, well, in fact, partly during the Second World War, but particularly after, the influence that this had on the modern world was profound. Thank goodness the scheme never got built, but what we are looking at is a way that we're saying that any city could be completely demolished and come into a frame like this. What we're looking at are these cruciform blocks as they bulge out and dominate the city, and these fast highways that are moving through. So if I take the model from this exhibit, you can see the highway is elevated. Guess what? I think we've seen this somewhere before. The gardens are somehow below, and these blocks are emerging about the city. Not only that, but Paris became the new movement center of a new world, because the two cross axes for the whole of France moved through, and as you see in my notes, they developed a new command center that would organize not only this but the whole of the road structure, and develop the new Paris to be working at something like 146 people per acre. Take the fact that we're lucky if we can achieve a tenth of that, and you can begin to see some people could look at this and say, I not only get a modern apartment, I actually get a bathroom, I get a kitchen, I get a view, I get the gardens at the bottom, and all the new people are wanting to be able to drive like crazy through the city, and this is incredibly appealing to me. And so these were the models that moved through the modern world, and particularly after the Second World War, you could begin to see the drumbeat of saying we've got to do better, we've got to bring about reform. Isn't this a way that we can really put a city on the map? And I look at this diagram, and again, it depends upon the value systems that you're using. obviously it's a very expensive form of architecture. Obviously, it's not just a change of the structure physically of the city, the whole of the social structure is gone. The habit of lingering in the street, of buying your local vegetables, drinking a cup of coffee, it's all internalized into these private domains which could become separated precincts, and possibly it's fine to go running in the day in this, but it may not be the best place to go at night. And I hope you see the relationship between these two diagrams. At the top we've got the Le Corbusier Plan Vauxhall, and then at the bottom, I think you can tune in, you can see we're looking at Stuyvesant Town, New York, and yes, it's different, but you can see a direct influence that took place. And we could have probably found far more profound influences elsewhere. So let's continue with this, but change gear, because now the second part of the thesis of Le Corbusier began with the idea that we actually needed grand new cities. So the idea of grand was that Corbusier didn't recognize the work of Garnier, thought that his weak need of why on earth would you want a city that was only 35,000 people? You really needed to be ranging towards a city that had order, it had efficiency, it had massive technological innovation. In the center, which we're looking at in this cartoon, you would have office skyscrapers, 60 stories in height, again cruciform in plan for reasons we don't quite know. Maybe the idea that you have all the elevators going through the middle core, and all of it sitting on one massive parking structure. And around the centre would be concentric rings of zoned apartments and garden apartments, where in actual fact we're sitting at the moment. So La Ville Contemporaine, the contemporary city of 1922, grew in idea and scheming through and later become La Ville Radieuse, the radiant city, which I suppose appeared more striking. And the radiant city comes from this diagram. So you can see the radiant is the idea of these axes, these grand, fast freeways that move out into the countryside. So let's just focus on this for a moment. Go to the center and you see in the middle of the city are capitalist offices. So here you are in office blocks, presumably there will be high-end apartments in here as well, and then you get a uniform set of blocks that are beginning to surround this, and all of this outside the main car parking structure that is underneath this is radiating out into gardens of this super block, as it was then referred to, and bang in the middle, which probably doesn't meet modern technological need, but is an airport. So the idea that you could fly in here from Marseille and you could land your plane and go into your office building across this wonderful space, and then you could drive out through the radiant city. So these drawings are some of the most profound drawings, I think, of the 21st century. If we just go back, if we go back to here, to me the potency of this is you're sitting at your Corbusier and Thonnet chair, and you can see the pot of coffee, and you're looking out over your terrace, and who wouldn't want to join this idea of the city? I think it's also important to notice, although again La Ville Radieuse did not take place, just like Plan Vauxhall, Corbusier believed that the governments would latch on to this and have this built. In a certain way it is built. So now we're looking at moving out in the city of La Ville Radieux, and you've got the green town. So the faster roads around the outside of this, you can see a super block that is now turned linear with a lot of corridors going down the middle of the block. Guess where we're seeing types of blocks like this, playing fields and ponds and whatever. And here you can do all your running, but there's none of the older things that we consider to be city. So, for example, the Siam group declared in one of their many, many motions that the street was redundant, that we must abandon the street at all costs. At this point, I think the Italians walked out of the Siam group and said, no, we believe in streets. We don't believe that, and we don't believe in this thesis. So here we are. We've moved to The Hague in Holland, and I think you can agree with me that here is the diagram. We're on what we later named pilotti. The blocks, for whatever reason, are floating above space. They're not creating spaces that are in any way endearing. But the idea that the space moves underneath, that the whole thing is a landscape garden, and that you can live in this super block. Many of these, of course, were built. Many of them were built through social housing in a whole variety of countries. Many of them have failed. Many have since been pulled down at enormous cost. Probably somewhere we can find some that are useful. And the final part of this thesis of Ville Radieux was that if you're a blue-collar worker, you basically moved out into the block that could go further out on the highway because perhaps you weren't distinguished enough to be in the core of the city, but still you wouldn't live in a regular cottage or in a small settlement. You continue to live in one of these blocks. So clearly we can see the reasoning behind the Marseille block and all the conjecture that occurred in schools of architecture in the second part of the 20th century, talking about this idea that architecture has become a machine, architecture can be the organizer of social space, and you look at the base of this, not a living soul. It's in effect perhaps an interesting art form. Look at the colours that were beginning to be introduced in the modern movement, but not much else. And when we come to American examples, this is perhaps one of the most daunting field visits that I undertook. A cold, wet day in Chicago, and we're looking at public housing in Chicago. Here, I hope you spotted it as the playground in the foreground. Extremely worrying, not terrible cold day. And how do you enter the building with this concrete elevator tower in the middle? Really a worrying experience to then walk along. Some of these are deck access, some of them are central corridor access. And yes, there is a difference between this and La Ville Radieux and Stuyvesant Town for that reason, but it's still incredibly frightening. And the third work that I wanted us to look at could not be more different. So we're now moving to Broadacre City, produced by, through his own account, America's only architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, and he believed in a total counter to the two prior theses. Why? Well, because he was Frank Lloyd Wright. And why? Because he wanted to demonstrate an alternative that was a truly American one. But also there's a lot more to the reading of this. Possibly it's because he was largely rejected in Chicago for controversial professional reasons, and out of this he moved to separating to a larger extent, partly to an inner suburb of the city, but partly also to Taliesin. And the idea that he developed in a thesis that he called The Disappearing City. So here is Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's giving this in the Kahn Lectures at Princeton in 1930, and then producing the book, The Disappearing City. Again, you'll find it directly in the library. And we can see that it not only counters because it's not a city, but it counters because it's demonstrating an alternative society, a society that's truly American, based on a resurrection of Jefferson, leading through Edison and the advent of electricity and lighting, but also resurrected through Ford and the idea that you could envisage a city at 60 miles an hour. Now, this is a literal value system in the development of Broadacre City. The fact you could travel on a highway at 60 miles an hour, this was a critical time scale in developing this, meant that you didn't need to live in a city. You could live in a small holding, so you would have your own individual home with your plot of land where you could grow vegetables. So this is demonstrated in this color collage in the middle, highly orthogonal, but with a sort of freedom of this organized idea of country. Then you would have the freedom of these growing gardens that would be intensive agriculture that would frame you and create, again, a sort of cordon sanitaire. The framing on the edge will be factories, but these will be all electrically driven and all be, in a way, quotes, nice factories. There will be good, clean jobs. You wouldn't even need to wear worker clothing. And to the side of that, you would have the 60-mile-an-hour highway. And then in amongst, you get little drips of nature, and you can see here with the lakes. And the other in amongst would be that you would, in this collage, begin to get distinguished odd buildings that would be community buildings. All of this was to be arranged by an architect. So the community architect, you would no longer have city government, but you would have towers in this that became, in effect, administrative sub-hubs. You would no longer need universities because everybody would learn from craft centres, and they'd learn on the land from, and you can see the little houses that are going through and how those conformed with where he was in architecture with the development of the Usonian house. And this was so powerful in the development of models. So here is a clay model where you can see very much the development of the single housing unit and the growing area and how you could come out from this. You pass these intensive agriculture. This is the belt that could have the factory, and then you come to the highway. And in amongst, you would get the odd architectural symbolism. And again, we've seen this in the towers that were built at the time that we're trying to demonstrate this form of architecture, the Price building, and we could find an equivalent tower in several places that were architectural in style and very special, but essentially sitting in an orthogonal field. So here I think is one of the most famous of these graphics with the new flying machines and the idea of an America that would be dispersed. To their credit of their knowledge at the time, they probably weren't too far out if you knew where America was in terms of its population mass in the 1930s and the growth of population. There was an argument that you could say we had so much land, we had so much opportunity to the land, and why don't we bring agriculture to the land? It's almost a taming of America. That you could argue that the calculations that we could live in this way could be correct, and the fact we didn't know the dangers of gasoline, and we hadn't worked out the fact that dispersal probably meant very strongly a cultural and ethnic separation which could have been intended. So you don't know how divisive this thesis might be.
One American architect foresaw that the automobile would turn the country into a vast suburb. In his Broadacre City project, first presented in 1935, Frank Lloyd Wright proposed a continental suburb, an even-handed national development plan. Broadacre would locate the suburb nowhere, yet everywhere. Farm and city were to be homogenized. The nation would become a continuously gridded but sparsely settled garden. Every family would own at least one tillable acre of land. Modern office and factory workers would exchange city pleasures for a quiet life in a sanitized and domesticated wilderness. Wright proposed that Broadacre City be run by architects. Their job would be to guarantee that Wright's version of the suburban dream was preserved. Broadacre City was doomed to remain on the drawing board. But speculative developers like Levitt understood its message clearly and borrowed freely from it. Placeless tract developments proliferated over the continent, completely ignoring the existing towns.
So, in summary, why have we addressed these three major books, the Cite Industrielle, the Ville, and Broadacre City, as displayed in the Disappearing City? It's simply because they are pivotal in our understanding of a historic evolution of the design of neighbourhoods and communities, but also because in their own way they had massive influence. You can see the Corbusian thesis time and time again has left us with a stigma, and the stigma is that bringing about density, placing people in a home that is other than a house, has profound difficulties attached to it. The other way round, the Frank Lloyd Wright thesis is indicating, particularly through an eye that is looking at how to corrupt that thesis and say, well, the greatest American architect said the suburb and suburbia is just fine. And so we're in a really quite serious dilemma, which I think we're coming through, but it's a question that it's saying, on the one hand, we tried wrecking up the city and pulling it down. That didn't work. We don't know what to do. We didn't like the blocks that were produced. We don't like the idea that the highways have pushed people out into the suburbs and sprawl and all the dangers of sprawl, which we're going to talk about. So profoundly, we're looking for a distinct alternative. And it's really this that is prompting us towards the next move into alternatives in the 21st century.